Okay, I should say before I begin that this is a paper, well, a study that both Marta and I have done, also with the involvement of our esteemed leader here at the front, Scholt, whose paper this was essentially based on and who we consulted on with the questions. Whether he wishes to be regarded as a co-author of this, perhaps he can tell us in 15 minutes. But what I want to do is to take you through, firstly, the essential insight behind this, the idea that what we need to try to understand the varieties of illiberalism in terms of how it functions as a differentiated critique of liberalism and liberal democracy that may have different facets in different cases and may have different manifestations across both across parties and across countries, as indeed we see in our empirical analysis. So this, no AUTHLIB funds were harmed in the fielding of these questions. This was from a set of some funds that I had for a separate questionnaire, and we decided to put these on the questionnaire in Poland and in Great Britain. There was no particular logic for doing that. It was more that this was these were the countries where I was fielding the questions at the time. I'd like to see how these work in other countries as well. But I think that some of the patterns that we see in the Polish and the Great Britain and the case of Great Britain show some of the both the similarities and the differences that we can expect to find in other European countries as well. So what we essentially did was to field this in two surveys where we used, for each of the 9 dimensions that I'll show you in a minute, 2 questions, one tapping illiberal attitudes through an illiberally coded question, the other tapping illiberal attitudes as the rejection of explicitly liberal statements. We then undertook an exploratory factor analysis, as we didn't have sort of strong theoretical preconceptions about exactly how these things would hang together. We just had the sense that conceptually many of these issues were likely to hang together in reasonably legible ways. We then, just to see how this works at the dimensions of political parties, ran multinomial regression analyses of vote choice on the latent dimensions that we find. I should stress that this is, in terms of analysis, but also in terms of the questions, very much preliminary work. These are open to all of the usual objections and sort of health concerns about the question wording. In some of the cases that we find, the analyses that we conduct show up certain ambiguities or certain issues that may be problematic with respect to certain of the questions. So just not to ask you to read through all this, but essentially these were the 9 dimensions in question. Varieties of different conceptually plausible varieties of illiberalism which we could operationalize as both in terms of agreement with illiberal positions on these issues, but also opposition to the liberal take on this. So, for example, in the case of the first here, populist illiberalism, agreement with the statement that the will of ordinary people should override decisions made by judges and experts, or agreement with the idea that we need competent bodies to defend freedoms and national interests, even when their decisions may go against what the majority thinks is right. So some fairly straightforward operationalizations, both of the populist take on the will of the people, but also the populist rejection of the idea that we need competent independent bodies, even if those are counter-majoritarian in character. So what we find, and I certainly don't expect you to read the lettering here, this is more just as an illustration that in both of the cases, Great Britain and in Poland, what we don't find is that we have simple acquiescence bias with the most socially desirable answer to this question. We did have some concerns that using agree-disagree statements here might lead us to end up with a bunch of disagreement with the illiberal positions and agreement with the liberal positions. But what we broadly find in both cases is that there are plenty of people who hold illiberal positions on each of these questions, and plenty of people who hold liberal positions at the same time. So we can see that while some of these variables are more skewed towards one side or the other, we nevertheless see a spread of liberal and illiberal opinions, which is then reflected in how these attitudes break down at the level of party support. So when we did the factor analysis, which, as I stress, was exploratory and very preliminary, we find in both cases that some of the variables cluster in ways which are intuitively plausible. We find, for example, in the case of broadly speaking liberal constitutionalism and individual autonomy, that we find that those who disagree with, for example, that the state should not interfere in people's freedom to express themselves in terms of the lifestyle they commit to, also correlates with other aspects of broadly conceived illiberal attitudes relating to personal autonomy and the role of the state in either curbing or facilitating that. So in some cases, as in this case, we find that these variables are more or less correlated with each other in both cases. We do, however, find, in this case of highlighted in red here, some variables sometimes go against what we would expect. It may be down to different interpretations of what precisely is meant by harmful values here, and whether both illiberals on the one hand and liberals on the other have similar interests in trying to repress harmful value, the promotion of harmful values. They just differ on what those values are. So if we break this down at the party level, in the first case, this is in Great Britain, we can see that reform, the light blue here, is much more illiberal or else considered on these issues than the majority of it, well, all of the other parties. We can see that in the case of the Conservatives, that being more illiberal on this dimension is associated with a somewhat higher probability of voting for the Conservatives. But in the case of the Reform Party, so the major illiberal party in the United Kingdom at the moment, the increase is much more significant. If we look at Poland, we can also see a familiar picture here. As civic platform goes down, or civic coalition goes down, law and justice goes up. So the more illiberal views you have on this dimension, the more likely you are to vote for law and justice. Another dimension, and this was the one we found both interesting overall, but also for the way that it breaks down country by country, was this dimension of broadly conceived religious liberalism, plus, in some cases, other aspects which often exist in that discourse along with religious attitudes, such as in the case of Poland, the question of gender equality. And in this case, what we find is, while in both cases these work pretty well as dimensions, on the party level, the picture is very different. The more illiberal you are by the lights of this conception in the United Kingdom, the less likely you are to vote for reform. Whereas in the case of Poland, the more illiberal you are, the more likely you are to vote both for law and justice, or for the not one but two Konfederacja parties that we have on the Polish right. And immediately, the explanation comes to mind for this, and this is a good example of when a little expert knowledge can help you explain what you see in the quantitative analysis, is that in the case of the Great Britain rather, because this was conducted purely in the Great Britain rather than in the United Kingdom overall, that reform are concerned here about what they see as the rise of radical Islam. And so they want to repress the rise of religious authorities and religiously motivated policymaking in the UK, because they associate that with the possibility of this phantom of the rise of Sharia law in the United Kingdom, for example, or the impact of Islamist potential of the creation of Islamist political parties. In Poland, the discourse is still firmly around the role of the Catholic Church in public life and the extent to which Catholic values should inform policy. So in this case, the more illiberal you are, the more likely you are to vote for parties that are broadly in favor of expanding or at least conserving the role of the Catholic Church in public life and in policy making. So here we have a situation in which both of these dimensions are present, but they mean very different things depending on the specific country context. We also find a number of other dimensions which broadly refer to the distinction between an open and closed society, so whether or not traditional norms should be upheld or should be questioned, but which again also negatively correlate with other items in ways that we need to explore more thoroughly. There are also, just to show briefly, this is something that this dimension still correlates to some extent with broad expectations. So the more illiberal parties, so liberal parties are, voters are more likely to vote for illiberal parties the more they agree on with these dimensions. In the case of, in some cases we find specific factors, specific dimensions that are only observed in one country rather than in the other. So in the case of Great Britain, for example, a dimension which is reflects some of the principles of paternalist illiberalism, which doesn't seem to be as politically salient in the Polish case. But even in the United Kingdom, we see that this doesn't really have much resonance at a political level. In Great Britain, we can also see a broad dimension which suggests that there is a section of the population, at least, for whom a number of these different illiberal ideas come together to form a general illiberal package. This doesn't come out in the Polish case. Polish illiberalism is more concentrated in certain aspects of illiberalism rather than present in a more general sense. So we can see here, for example, that, again, the more you have this multifaceted illiberal set of attitudes, the more likely you are to vote for Reform, which is a party that is bringing together various strands of illiberalism into a coherent political appeal. Whereas for the other parties, it doesn't really seem to have much of an impact. In the case of Labour Party, those who are more illiberal are significantly less likely to vote for this party, but Reform stands out to a great extent. In the case of Poland, we didn't find any particular interesting distinctions there. On the case of libertarian and traditionalist liberalism, we find some element of this in the Polish case, where we have those who have a more libertarian, a liberal set of attitudes are somewhat more likely to vote for parties of the broadly conceived libertarian right, in particular Konfederacja, which has built its appeal on that particular variant of illiberalism. But again, it's not a strong and particularly convincing finding. And there are other, as we suspect, somewhat residual categories that don't really seem to have a particularly strong impact, but which bring together some of these aspects in ways that nevertheless do have some degree of relationship with how people vote. In this case, voting for law and justice is clear, where we see people who have who are in favor of strong leaders, who tie this together with an economic materialist illiberalism and a lack of concern with the interest of marginalized groups. So above all, we find that illiberalism, as originally suggested in Scholt's article, is complex, is internally differentiated, both in a conceptual fashion and also empirically, as we see here. There are, certainly when reading the initial article, there are certain varieties of illiberalism which we might have expected to hang together somewhat more closely than we find in the data that we've collected. But where we do find a strong association between them, it is broadly intelligible in terms of the patterns that we can observe in countries where illiberal parties are currently politically significant and important. The key thing to highlight from, in particular from the findings on the religious dimension of illiberalism, speaks to precisely what Jan was talking about earlier, that contextual factors can have a significant impact on how issues are framed and understood as illiberal in character. In the case of religion, this is clear when we see that what is seen as liberal or illiberal in Poland compared with Great Britain produces different results depending on what associations are made with religiosity. In the case of Poland, clearly the association was with radical Islam, which explains why it's so popular with reform supporters. In the case of Poland, it's still about the role of the Catholic Church. So aspects of the final point I would make is that we also see in some of the negative loadings here the fact that aspects of illiberalism coexist with aspects of liberalism. Embracing illiberalism on some dimensions doesn't always mean rejecting liberalism in all of its guises. So that's something that we need to explore in particular further, where these differences exist and what might explain them. Is it just a problem with our question wording, or do we find that that illiberals' attitudes are more mixed and more variegated than the conceptions of liberalism might lead us to suppose? And that's where I'll finish. Thank you.